Okay, so let's turn on the camera here. Let me see just who we have in the room. Stefano, Wei, Julian, Jürgen. Okay. So yeah, sure. Everyone's welcome to listen. Sorry. So the trigger for this thing, there was actually a discussion in the committers list a few weeks ago about the idea of adding new committers, and the idea of adding new committers was proposed not because, basically because to make it easier for those people to commit patch series, basically just to do the kind of admin work of taking patches off the list and putting them in the tree. Now, a little bit of history here. So back when Zen started, it was foreseen that Zen would be, like Linux, follow the benevolent dictator model. And for a long time, the benevolent dictator was a guy named Keir Fraser. And that, I mean, kind of worked okay. But at some point, Keir basically kind of disappeared. And the rest of us, this is my memory, so Ian was also there. He can correct my, basically, the rest of us said, okay, well, we have to have a new way of deciding what's going to happen. And so what we did is we said, okay, we need to have some sort of a leadership team. Oh, the other thing was, yeah, I've given talks about this before. We were about to have a controversial discussion. And when you have a controversial discussion, it is important that there be a fallback so that if you can't agree, that like something still happens, stuff still moves forward, okay? So Keir had kind of faded away, and so we said, okay, well, we have to have a group of people who, even if after the discussion happens, there's no clear answer that everyone agrees on, we have to be able to decide somehow and just move forward. And so what we decided to do was to take this role of committer and make that into a leadership role. So we had, at that time, what, maybe 3 or 4 committers? I forget, Ian. And we just said, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll say, if you're a committer, then you are a, if you're a committer, then you're on the leadership team. And we'll just make a majority vote of that. So in the meantime, we have added more committers, and we've got a much more diverse leadership team as a result. So we have, there are 7 of us now, I believe. So we have myself and Ian Jackson and Andy Cooper from Citrix. We have Wei, who is now at Microsoft, who was at Citrix. We have Julian, who was at Citrix a long time ago and now is at Amazon. Stefano and Jan Bulik. Is there anybody I missed? Ian? From Zuza. I can see your mouth, but I can't hear your voice. So.
Sorry, yes, I'm afraid I don't know the answer because I have to look that up every time.
Right. Okay.
Precisely, and we've got like these several different hats, and if you want to know particular what set of hats anybody has at any one time, you have to go look that up.
Right. Yeah, so we have the committer hat, we have the security team hat, we have all these other random stuff. So Conrad Vilk was a committer for a while, and he stepped down. So anyway, so the thing is here, there's actually been a little bit of, so we have the rest, which is actually, who is the maintainer, who gets CC'd on the mails that don't have an explicit maintainer in the file. So one of the things that happens is if you join the leadership team and you're a committer, then suddenly you get spammed with all the patches which which don't have some other committer, with some other maintainer. And of course, if you want to be a committer just to be able to check stuff in, then that spam puts you on the leadership team. So the Zen governance specifies that there will be a leadership team, that each sub-project can choose their own style of leadership team. It does recommend having the committers be a leadership team, but that's obviously something that we can change on our own. So I think there's basically a couple of questions. First of all, I've got 3 questions here that we can just kind of toss out and discuss, and we don't have to come up to an answer, but I just want to see where people are. The first is whether we should separate the rest from the committers and have a different group of people be maintainers for things the unmaintained. The second would be whether we should separate committers from decouple committers from the hypervisor leadership, so that we can add more committers and have the hypervisor leadership be separate. And the next question would be, do we want to think about changing how the hypervisor leadership thing kind of works? As far as leadership considerations, and there's a couple different ways that we could do it. We could basically say anyone that has enough standing in the community can get a vote, and then we could just have, if it's 30 or 40 people that are all voting on whatever topic that we're voting about, then that's fine. The other option would be to say decisions are made better in a relatively small team. Having a committee of a smaller group of people between 5 and 7, an odd number, so that there's never a tie, and 5 and 7 gives you, it's enough that you have a diversity of viewpoints, but it's not so much that people's voice gets kind of lost and you get weird politics games and that kind of stuff, hopefully. And obviously another factor that we want to consider in this is diversity of organization. So we always, when we're making decisions about who the committers are, it's very easy for Citrix to kind of accidentally dominate the Zen project just because of how many of us there are, and our historical position in the project. And so it's very important for us to make sure that we have a balance between Citrix people and non-Citrix people. So there's all the kind of factors that I think about when I think about the leadership stuff. So I guess I would say start with the first question first. Are there any objections or opinions on the idea of separating maintainership of the rest from committers?
I personally don't see the extra emails as a problem. Realistically, there are fairly few emails that fall into that category after several bug fixes to the get maintainers script. So that side of things I don't think is a problem. There does need to be someone, a group of people responsible for the dribs and drabs, and having that the same as the people able to commit is probably reasonable. There's a lot of random stuff in the tools directory that no one cares to own. And getting bug fixes into that can be fairly difficult.
So there's a question on the public chat about what's in the rest. Well, so first of all, actually, a lot of the hypervisor common code is in the rest. Huge amounts of like the include files are all in the rest, and then there's just loads of just random who knows what in the tools directory or other places that fall under the rest. It would probably be good as a separate thing. It would probably be good to have to sit down and think about, can we get some volunteers to rebalance some of the maintainership boundaries, to find people to step up officially to take care of some of these things.
So, George, is there a list of what the rest is that somebody could come along and take a look at and say, okay, I'd be willing to do this?
It's an inverse. So basically, I don't think it'd be hard. So basically, there's the maintainers file, and there's a get maintainers.pl. Basically, you could do find dot dash type f, and then find and basically give the list of all the files that don't have a maintainer, and then that will give that's the rest basically.
Yeah, the maintainers file very specifically says the rest covers everything, because that's the point of it. It doesn't have a list of the things not covered by anything else in the maintainers file.
Right. So Roger says we should have hypervisor common code out of the rest. So I think that makes sense. We should probably have some. We should probably get some common hypervisor maintainers for that. So that would be a good thing.
In reality, if the project were to start again from scratch today, what would likely happen, or what we would expect to happen, is have the hypervisor in one repository and the tool stack in a separate repository. And that is that in particular makes it impossible to provide both halves of a broken API in the same change set, so it appears to work. It would certainly be good for the longevity of stable APIs. It's not like that because of the history of how Zen works, but it is something I have planned for the future work to stabilize the tool's APIs. So it might be, this problem might become easier if in the future we are able to split zen.git in half and have the hypervisor part of zen.git and the tools part of zen.git as separate repositories.
I mean, that would also solve the problem of the rest maintaining both common hypervisor code and parts of the, or fun parts of the tool stack, I guess. So I think it should be fine.
I'm not sure how it would help, actually. One of the main things I've noticed in common codes, at least from the Amazon side, is really difficult to get commands on common code. It's going to be mostly Yarn. On getting input from others maintainers is going to be really difficult. So it feels to me that the rest needs to have either been refreshed or having a way to communicate a bit better, to get more inputs on Yarn or AWS to do the review.
So from my perspective, there's kind of, when you have more people responsible for something, more people can say that is someone else's responsibility. Does that make sense? So I almost always ignore almost everything from the rest because I'm like, I don't know anything about this, it's not my job. And so I think having a group of people explicitly responsible for the core, rather than just being the rest, would mean that basically you would have, it would be different, right? So when you got a thing for something in Zen Common, then those however many people, 3-4 people, would know it's one of their jobs to do it, instead of saying, well, there's 7 people, we're not sure exactly whose job it is to do it, and then Jan kind of stepping up because that's just kind of his character. He's always going to comment on as many things as he can. So, and also no one else is doing it, so he feels like he has to do it, right? So if there was a smaller group of people that was specifically focused on the Zen Common Code, then I think it would be easier to have that problem would be solved.
I think that would be an improvement over the status quo.
I think so. I think it's worth a try. I think what we are today is a bit difficult. It can make a few people not wanting to contribute to the common code anymore.
Right, I agree with this. I think shrinking the REST maintainership and or splitting it up is a really good idea. It's always been a bit of an anomaly. I'm not sure that this relates particularly to like committership or leadership team questions. I would favor keeping the leadership team large and maybe even expanding it. As greater input from all sections of the community as possible.
I think it's fair to say so that looks like we want to have different policies or maybe different ideas on how to expand or restrict the rest compared to the leadership team. So I think, without getting whether we want to expand or restrict the rest, or expand or restrict the leadership team, or in what way, it definitely looks like there are different ideas and policies that we will apply to the two groups. So maybe it makes sense, one thing, to reply to the first question with maybe we want to conceptually consider them two separate group of people, although initially they might be seeded with the same names, but two different group of people. And then we can get into the details on how to modify both groups.
So I think, given the time that we have, I think sorting out the rest stuff can probably be done fairly easily online and over email. So I kind of get the impression Ian is pushing towards discussing the leadership question. So I think maybe I agree with that. So
one quick, George, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
In terms of for the common, right?
Yeah.
What's going to be your guys' criteria for somebody to be able to step up to that? Like, are you going to just let anybody say, "Hey, I want to do this," or do they have to have a track record of committing code?
Generally, that's a question left to the leadership team, which I know is a very amorphous and circular argument. It's certainly the case that we have maintainers in specific areas of the hypervisor who have demonstrated an interest in progressing the code. In that we have maintainers who are not committers. And any area of specific code like that is fine. The problem here is that there is no explicit maintainership status for the common hypervisor code. We've got the ARM subsystem, the x86 subsystem, and everyone able to commit to the entire project.
If I can come in and answer Daniel's question directly, I think the answer to that is we would, even splitting REST out, supposing we do that, the way it would work is you'd want a track record of review at the very least of commits to the hypervisor, whether that was writing them yourself or good quality reviews, because that's basically the maintainer role. And if you take an interest in the code there and produce reviews that are of high quality, somebody will want to make you a maintainer. That will happen. We'll definitely want to make you a maintainer.
Yeah. So for instance, different parts of the code happen slightly differently, but basically, for instance, Thomas did a lot of work on the mem sharing, on the memory protection and much of that code. And so basically we asked him if he wanted to be the maintainer because he was doing a lot of work in it. So yeah, I think the main criteria would be that, as Ian said, an exhibition that you are familiar with the code, and active in the community. So either contributing and or reviewing. Yeah. I don't think it would have to be like a multi-year thing. Like if you decided you were gonna, if you had the goal, say, I want to be a maintainer of this thing, and you just made it a point to, once a week do a review or something like that for the next 6 months, then we could then that might be enough to consider you to add you to the position, for instance.
In reality, I think in this case, there a lot of the Trench Brute and Fidelis plans actually have quite wide-reaching implications across large areas of the hypervisor. So I think in practice, some of that would fall under the general existing maintainership. But that's certainly not to say that maybe things like the interaction with the TPM or senter or SKinit might not reasonably fall under a more specific maintainership. So at the end of the day, those side of things, probably the most important thing is that you don't accidentally break the crypto in it, because that renders the rest of the security useless. And that requires a high degree of understanding and review of changes.
I think for a maintainer, the most important thing isn't, I mean, it is important to have knowledge of the code. The more important thing is to understand where you don't have knowledge and to, and to tread within one's area of expertise. And also, and this is a bit difficult to nail down, to have kind of good taste about the direction of evolution of the project. And those things are difficult to pin down, but they're quite easy to see in people's reviews. Particularly, care about how people deal with things that they don't know about and how people approach wider design questions, and also how they interact with the community and communicate well and kindly and so forth.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so back to the leadership question. So Ian, I'm just curious if we did an a big expansion of the leadership team, what would be the criteria for people being on the team versus off the team? How do you envision that? I think
it requires so leadership is a bit different from maintainership. It's much more of a management-y kind of role. I mean, I don't like to use the M word, but it involves skills of both mediation, where you you try to decode what other people are saying and find the way to get everybody happy, and that's obviously the thing that we most want to do. But it also requires a sense of fairness and understanding of the project's processes, understanding of how to give feedback well and when to give feedback privately and when to do it publicly, and a lot of kind of difficult, squishy stuff, and also some less squishy, kind of fairly hard-edged questions of governance or ethics or, clarity of communications. And those are the skills that I would expect out of somebody who we gave a leadership role. And much of that will overlap with the senior maintainer, because maintainership is often about, mentorship and stewarding the code and stewarding people. But leadership is much more that, and that's not necessarily the same people.
Right. So I guess would you envision just people putting forward other people for the leadership team, or putting themselves forward for the leadership team, and then the leaders having a discussion and then bringing people in? Or
right. I think the way there probably ought to be a consultation that would start. I mean, it's a bit like a job hunt, right? So you start by identifying the possibility that we might expand the leadership team, or that there are candidates. And that would start out privately, and the existing leadership team would have a private discussion. And if they felt it an appropriate thing to go ahead, then probably it would be a good idea to have a public consultation of the form like, we are considering the following names, or we are considering expanding the team, or we're short of people with the following skills, or whatever that was. And then the decision, I mean, these are personnel matters. You can't have the debate in public,
right.
But you can invite input from the developer community.
Right.
I'd like to make a comment. So some of this is about sort of like jurisdiction, in a way disaggregating leadership is a bit like gerrymandering. And so the important to remember that Zen's role in the ecosystem changes over time. For example, when KVM came along, it kind of recalibrated influence on the hardware. So we maybe followed some things rather than led them. Meaning the hardware, some early hardware changes followed Zen, but now they follow KVM, for example. Because maybe more Intel folks work on KVM. And then on the ARM side, maybe the safety critical work with Zen might lead the way, for example, or Sherry. So Lars did a lot of that work, right? Lars went around to all those other communities and bridged their influences back into Zen. And not, it's something we can necessarily fill Lars's shoes. So you almost kind of need a part of the governance which recognizes that the governance is not actually happening in Zen anymore for big chunks of things that Zen depends on. And therefore, you might want to have to fill that role somehow with multiple people representing different stakeholders. And Trench Boot is a great example because 2 years ago, we had a Zen Summit in China, explained that, hey, Windows is going to have these changes and you're not going to be able to run Windows anymore if you don't do something about this missing piece of the stack. And if there was no Trench Boot now and all this missing re-architecture, it would be really hard to catch up. It would take like another 2 years to build out all the pieces, including DOM-B and so forth. So I'm just saying there might be other things out there coming down the pipeline that we might need people
So
to think about.
I think, Rich, you're saying maybe we're not doing, particularly now, we've lost Lars, we're not doing as much of that kind of outreach and bringing stuff into the projects, and allowing ourselves to be influenced by that as we should be.
And not just outreach, negotiation. Yeah.
It's almost like the business relationships team works on project, or partner relationships.
That's kind of the beginning of the funnel, but the result of that business relationship is to have a very deep technical discussion about APIs or.
No, absolutely, yeah.
Right. I think the skills, those kind of outreach skills and kind of negotiation skills are a bit different to governance type skills. We don't really have a place where those outreach skills easily sit in our current arrangements. I mean, maybe all those people with those different skills could all be on the leadership team.
I agree. Sure. I'm just saying we were lucky because we had those skills for 10 years, even though they were not formally in the
right.
structure.
Right, and maybe we should be doing something to make a space for that.
So I think as far as the Hypervisor, so yeah, I mean, I definitely think we need the business development side of things and outreach and that kind of stuff. As far as the leadership team roles go, I mean, from my perspective, sometimes basically we need some way to decide, and that's not terrible. It doesn't need to be the best way. It just needs to be some way that and everyone needs to know what the way is. And ideally, everyone in the community needs to know that their needs are going to be considered when decisions are made, right? And specifically, so the topic where we decided that we really absolutely had to have a leadership team before we started the conversation was the question of who is going to be allowed on the Zen security advisory list, the pre-disclosure list, right? If we didn't have a clear way of making that decision, if everyone didn't see that decision was made with their considerations in mind, right? Not everyone is going to be happy. There was no answer there that was going to make everybody happy, right? The important thing was that everyone understand how the decision was made, and that decision be made, and everyone understand how it was made, and that they could see that their ideas were considered. And also, I think in the future, seeing how they could, if they invest time in the project and in the Zen project, they're going to gain influence and people are going to consider them, right? So I think as far as the leadership team, the main thing that I see is this kind of voting thing, right? If you have the right benevolent dictator, that can work okay. It's worked okay. I mean, it's worked okay for Linux, and Ian disagrees, right? Some projects it works worse for, right? There's lots of Python kind of worked okay for a long time, but obviously they switched it, So I do agree. I do think that having a team, we've had a team for a long time, and I think having a team really works for our community. So I don't particularly care how big the team is or who's on it, as long as everyone can see that, as long as we have some way of making a decision, and the people on that leadership team are going to make reasonably good decisions, and everyone can see how they can influence that team and make sure that that team will make decisions that are in their own interests, right? So, yeah. So for instance, OpenXT, I'm not sure, Rich, how you feel about this, right? So you guys depend a lot on Zen, but there's no one from the OpenXT community like on the leadership team, right? Is that okay? Is that something you would like to change? And it's difficult to know what imaginary decisions are going to come down the line in the future that we're going to have a vote on that are going to affect you. So anyway, that's my rant about leadership.
Well, that's sort of where I was going, right? I think I don't know how to explain. It's kind of like laws partly influence the community, but laws also kind of have to follow behavior, right? What people actually do. And if you look at the behavior of the Zen community, our solution to governance is to leave.
What?
To fork.
A solution to governance is to fork.
Yes, look at the Zen community. Why did Kier leave? Why did Ian Pratt leave? I mean, they forked. They went off and created Uzen. They created Bromium. It's now in millions of devices. It's still basically Zen, very strong influence. Mm-hmm. But it's a different choices, different needs, and so forth. Cubes is different. OpenXT is different. There are a few other forks. So one of the things we've talked about over the years is how to bring these back together, right? Maybe learning. It doesn't have to be the code. It can be the approach, the technique. So that was kind of where I was saying that there might be this need for things which the governance can't really be in Zen. It will kind of always be on these outside places, and you need a way to bring that input back in. There are structural reasons why it can't all be in one place. So
I think Rich is finding many other important key roles that mostly Lars was covering before, and now we don't really have an official position for. Like, for instance, there isn't really one that is in charge, not even in the governance, that not even the committers are in charge or even responsible for helping bringing back or aligning forks, which is a very important role, right? And in every community there are forks, and in any community you need to find a way to kind of merge them back or align them, and work with all these other, like, for instance, think about Linux RT for Linux and things like that. But yeah, I think what George was aiming at is mostly to understand the current existing scope of the leadership team, which is actually far narrower. So it's mostly about voting on these agreements. So I wonder if these new, I think it's fair to have somebody that is in charge for bringing back or aligning forks. Should it be the Linux leadership team? Should it be another team? I don't think we necessarily want another.
So for example, George, you made a comment that OpenXT didn't have a place on the leadership team. I disagree entirely. We had an enormous place on the leadership team through Lars, right? Mm-hmm. I interact with Lars, very frequently, and in any challenging thing, we went and asked questions and so forth, and then brought it to the larger community. I would also point out that in the Zen community itself, right, you can have situations where people make a decision and there might even be a vote, but then maybe not everyone is fully on board. And in the current process, they could sort of slow roll their reviews of some patches on the topic that was voted on, and maybe those patches never get in. Or maybe it just sort of becomes known that's a hot button area. Don't even send your patch. It's going to cause a big, a lot of time to be spent, and it won't get merged anyway. And that is potentially a thing that influences Zen today. And I would argue those can only be solved through forks. You have a fork. If the fork proves in the market and evidence that it works, then it has a better chance of being revisited in Zen.
So So one of the reasons why I was suggesting, and I was thinking of suggesting, but I think I never said that, of allowing the increase of the leadership team, but also allowing people in the leadership team from, let's say, OpenXT or the community at large, not necessarily a Zen maintainer. I actually don't have a clear idea of what I'm about, but somebody, let's say, that today will consider external, to give us a better viewpoint, to help us, have a more diverse viewpoint in the leadership of Zen. So if we take what Jan said of increasing the leadership team and increasing it also by adding, think about a TSC of a larger project that has community representatives, right? Like some of the Linux Foundation TSC used to be. So like a foreign viewpoints, so somebody that is not necessarily a maintainer but recognized, that might address some of those rich points.
Along this line, I think I agree with what Rich and Stefano have been saying. I personally have done a very large amount of trying to interact with some more of our external projects. So I ended up participating in the Cube Summit a couple of weeks ago, and I'm helping out with Trench Boot because, frankly, it's an interesting thing. I certainly do think that development of Zen as a whole lacks understanding of how Zen is commonly used. I would recommend that everyone who is a main developer in Zen goes and looks at how some of the downstream Linux distros deal with us, how the big name Zen downstreams deal with us. Because let's face it, Qubes is actually fairly well known and fairly well respected in the security community, and that has a massive benefit for us, but there's very little interaction. And yes, we have some bug fixes now coming back upstream, but there are a lot of things that have been worked around locally because attempting to contribute changes back like that is incredibly difficult. I think the leadership team for the Hypervisor project does not need to be the same as the committers. I think how the mechanics of shuffling code around zen.git is separate from general leadership of the project, and I think general leadership of the project would benefit from trying to include some of the major downstreams. One thing, I realize I was slightly late to the start of this. Did we go over exactly what the current leadership roles are? Because in reality, it comes down to, as far as we're voting on governance changes and attempting to calmly de-escalate arguments as and when they do occur.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I think one of the main roles of one of the main things that causes votes at the moment is disagreements about between maintainers about different topics, and I think that's suboptimal. And I think I don't know if we I don't know. I'm not sure how much OpenXT and Qubes and stuff want to settle an argument behind whether we should do A or B in this code thing.
So I have no data on those specific decisions, but I would just point out that is extremely valuable data, and you should have a special team that just is tasked with going through the entire history of all such challenging issues, because it's not about the specific issue. There's always a pattern there, and if you don't address that pattern, they will come back in other quote-unquote independent issues.
That's a very interesting observation. Certainly, some of us have indeed spotted some patterns. I think we're working to address them. It's not always easy.
So we've got about 3 minutes left, I think. let me see.
Looks right to me.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's happening here is like we talk about the leadership team, and it makes it sound like it makes a lot of strategic decisions, and sometimes it makes strategic decisions, but most of the decisions that the leadership team, the committers, they're minor. They're individually minor things, and they're normally, to an extent, it's kind of like a bit of interpersonal friction or different views about how code should be structured, that kind of thing. And I agree with Rich that we need to look at those patterns and improve that. But what that means is that the committers, as currently constituted, is not really a place where we could invite OpenXT or Cubes or Bromium to come and tell us, to come and, provide input to what we should be doing, because it's not going to be really the same kind of forum. So maybe we should take that as a suggestion to create some different strategic discussion or input thing.
That is exactly the same thing I was thinking. So the reason I not sent that email where I was suggesting to increase maybe the leadership team with foreign views is that I realized that the leadership team, what it does today is mostly, arbitrate between friction and conflicts. You don't really want to invite somebody, to do that kind of work. I mean, it's not really, I was trying to be inclusive and provide different viewpoints, but that's not really the right forum, right? You just need somebody with good people skills, not somebody interested in moving necessarily Xen forward or in new directions, right? So maybe we need two places.
Maybe committers could be the one that takes care of those, let's say, code-related issues, and leadership focus on whatever leadership should be doing instead of trying to solve disputes between developers or committers themselves.
So if we consider committers only about the code, and let's not call them leadership team for a moment, which, today leadership team doesn't mean that much, like you said, but then yes, right, a vote of the committers could arbitrate between committers' disputes. Doesn't necessarily need to change the governance. And then maybe the governance, we could put it together with more the other squishy, softy, skills required to do a relationship and invite other external views and things like that.
Okay, well, I think we've got a lot of, I think this has been a good talk in the sense that I think we've got a lot of ideas out. Do we want to, so I'm trying to think how to bring this together and how to move forward with this. Maybe we can, maybe people can so we've got a recording of the session. I'll at least we'll listen through again to try and pick up things maybe that I missed or whatever, and perhaps we can have bring this up again at a community call or some other forum where we can discuss more ideas about specific things to change. People don't seem objective to the idea of separating the rest from committers and committers from the hypervisor leadership. So. And then we could basically say, if we wanted to say, we could just say code stuff does just go to the committers. And it wouldn't matter if we had, 20 people voting on, bike shed coding issues. It's just fine.
I think the only concerns of increasing the number of committers is we need to trust the committers as they have access to the full tree. So if you increase the number of persons, then you need to make sure that you don't accept anyone random, and you also have issue if you start to merge things, because there may be more conflict as there is more people trying to commit together.
I think it's going to be mostly fine. Say FreeBSD, take FreeBSD as an example. There are far more committers than we have. And basically, yeah. And Roger, you can comment, right?
FreeBSD still uses SVN, which doesn't get the conflicts that you get from Git, because on Git you always have to be on head to commit. I think on SVN you can commit even if your tree is out of date.
But I think the most important thing is that the FreeBSD committers only commit to the areas that they are responsible for, even though they have commit rights to the whole tree. And so I believe we can follow the same model. That wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, that's how the current model works. And yes, the granularity of permissions is the Git repo as a whole. You have to trust that anyone who can write to it will not abuse their power.
Right. But in practice, we've got basically no problems with conflicts. Partly because in practice, people tend to commit. I'm not going to commit something to the hypervisor unless it's obvious that it needs to be done now, and that the people who would normally commit hypervisor stuff aren't available.
Yeah.
And that separation of stuff is, it's kind of a bit like the maintainership model, and it's all informal. We don't write this down. It's just a convention amongst the committers, but I don't see that changing. And we don't have any like commit wars or anything. And so long as we have a practice amongst most of the committers of rebasing things onto staging before we push them. So we don't have typically merge conflict, merge commits with conflict resolutions in them either. Yeah. That's done before the push. So I think this will be fine. We can have a lot more committers before this stops scaling.
Particularly as hopefully in a couple of years we'll have all this, like we'll have a CI loop that will take our stuff, run a whole bunch of things, and then a committer just says merge it, and then that will be merged.
Right.
And hopefully not a couple of years. Hopefully somewhat sooner than that. But yes, you've always got to trust the committers. I don't think that's a problem. Where we do get arguments over code, it's always borne out on Zendevel in email form before code actually hits the repository. So we do have issues there, and they lead to some of the arguments that need resolution. But all of that happens on the Devel mailing list. It doesn't get to problems with the repository itself.
Okay, so we're 5 minutes over time, and I would like a break before my talk at 4:30. So, yeah, I will. We got the recording of the session. I will listen through it and try to figure out if I can come up with some way forward where we can continue this discussion and come to some kind of a resolution. Yeah, I mean, I do.
Thanks, George. Can you try and make sure that people, because this format makes it difficult to speak up if you're not already a, prominent member of the community. It would be nice if whatever you did made it easy for people to give input in a less scary way.
Right. Okay, I will see what I can do about that. Okay, I guess thanks everyone. We'll see you back in the hallway.